are places in this world where the barrier between the living and the dead is not just thin, but shattered entirely. We often look to ancient castles or fog-shrouded cemeteries for these ruptures in reality. But sometimes, the most terrifying hauntings are housed within steel and rivets, floating monuments to human ambition that became reservoirs for human tragedy. You are listening to Nocturnal Ledger, and today we are boarding a vessel that has seen the height of luxury and the depths of war, a ship that is officially retired yet remains arguably the most active paranormal location on the planet. This is the true, documented history of the RMS Queen Mary. To understand why this ocean liner, now permanently docked in Long Beach, California, is considered a sanctuary for over 150 distinct entities, we must look beyond the ghost stories and into the cold, hard facts of her existence. This is not a legend born of campfires. The hauntings of the Queen Mary are supported by decades of ship logs, official accident reports, military records, and the terrified testimonies of police officers, marine engineers, and skeptics who boarded the ship expecting a museum and left believing in the afterlife. The story begins in the shipyards of Clydebank, Scotland, in the 1930s. From the moment her keel was laid, the Queen Mary was a titan, a symbol of the British Empire's dominance over the waves. But she was born into a world on the brink of chaos. While she was designed for high society, for champagne and ballrooms, destiny had a darker purpose in store. When World War II erupted, the Queen Mary was stripped of her luxury. Her hull was painted a somber, elusive shade of gray to hide her from Nazi U-boats in the Atlantic fog. She became the Gray Ghost. It is during this era that the ship's spiritual battery began to charge. The most catastrophic event in the ship's history, and the source of much of the paranormal activity experienced today, occurred on October 2nd, 1942. The Queen Mary was carrying thousands of American troops, slicing through the water in a zigzag pattern to evade enemy submarines. She was being escorted by the HMS Curacoa, a light cruiser tasked with protecting the massive liner. The physics of a ship the size of the Queen Mary are terrifying. She creates a vacuum, a slipstream that can pull smaller vessels toward her if they get too close. Through a miscalculation and a breakdown in communication, the HMS Curacoa drifted into the path of the Gray Ghost. The collision was not a bump. It was an execution. The reinforced steel bow of the Queen Mary sliced through the Curacoa like a guillotine. The cruiser was cut in half because of the strict orders to never stop, lest she become a sitting duck for German torpedoes. The captain of the Queen Mary had to make the most heart-wrenching decision of his life. He ordered the ship to keep moving. Behind them, in the freezing, oil-slicked waters of the Atlantic, over 300 men from the Curacoa drowned or were crushed by the debris. The vibrations of that impact, the sound of tearing metal, and the collective psychic shock of 300 sudden deaths imprinted onto the Queen Mary. Paranormal investigators and mediums who walk the bow of the ship today often report an overwhelming sensation of guilt, of panic, and the phantom sound of rushing water and screaming metal. This is not folklore. The collision is a historical fact, and the psychic wound remains open. When the war ended and the ship returned to civilian service, the hauntings did not cease. They evolved. The ship was retrofitted for leisure, but the dead were already stowaways. As we delve deeper into the specific hotspots of the ship, we must address the most infamous location on board. A room that became so active, so physically dangerous to the psychological well-being of guests, that the management was forced to seal it off from the public for decades. This is Cabin B340. The legend of Cabin B340 is a tapestry of rumors. Nard, but the documented reports from guests and staff paint a consistent and terrifying picture. In the late 1960s and early 70s, after the ship had docked in Long Beach and was converted into a floating hotel, the complaints regarding this specific room began to pile up in the security logs. These were not vague feelings of unease. Guests would call the front desk in the middle of the night, hysterical, demanding to be moved. They reported the sound of heavy knocking on the walls when no one was in the adjacent cabins. They described the water faucets turning on and off with violent force. But most chilling were the physical interactions. Multiple independent reports from different years describe the sensation of bed sheets being ripped off the bed while the guests were sleeping. One particular account from a businessman in 1966 details how he woke up to see a dark figure standing at the foot of his bed. When he reached for the lamp, the figure didn't vanish into thin air. It walked backward, fading into the bathroom door. The activity in B340 became so aggressive that the ship's operators, Disney at the time, decided it was a liability. They gutted the room and used it for storage, hoping that removing the bed and the guests would quiet the spirit. It didn't. Security guards doing their rounds on the B deck reported hearing angry voices coming from the locked, empty room. Some reported seeing a man in 1930s attire pacing the corridor outside the door, only to vanish when approached. The room has since been reopened for those brave enough to pay a premium, and the logbook provided for guests is filled with scrawled, shaky handwriting detailing sudden temperature drops, unexplained bruises, and the feeling of being strangled by invisible hands. But the horror of the Queen Mary is not confined to a single cabin. It permeates the infrastructure. We must descend into the bowels of the ship, to the watertight doors of the engine room. This is the domain of door number 13, and the tragic fate of a young crewman named John Pedder. In 1966, the ship was nearing the end of her seagoing career. John Pedder, aged just 18, was working in the area known as Shaft Alley. The watertight doors on the Queen Mary are massive, hydraulic steel barriers designed to seal off sections of the ship in the event of a breach. During a drill, or perhaps due to a misunderstanding of the timing, Pedder attempted to slip through the closing door. He didn't make it. The door crushed him. The official accident report is gruesome, but the aftermath is even more unsettling. Since that day, countless sightings have been reported in Shaft Alley of a young man in blue coveralls. He is often seen walking along the catwalks or standing in the shadows near door 13. What makes the Pedder apparition so distinct is that he often appears solid. Witnesses do not think they are seeing a ghost. They think they are seeing a tour guide or maintenance worker. It is only when they ask him a question or look away and look back that they realize he has vanished. There is a tactile nature to the haunting in Shaft Alley. People report being touched on the shoulder or feeling a breath on their ear in the stifling heat of the engine room. Some have recorded EVPs, or electronic voice phenomena, in this area. When researchers ask, "Is anyone here?" the playback often reveals a breathless, strained male voice answering, or sometimes the sound of metal clanging against metal, echoing the tragic crush that ended Pedder's life. Moving up from the industrial depths to the first-class swimming pool, we encounter a different kind of dread. The pool is currently empty, a cavernous, tiled space that echoes with the slightest sound. It is widely considered the vortex of the ship's supernatural energy. The atmosphere here is heavy, often described as suffocating. The air is still, yet the sounds of splashing water are frequently heard by security guards patrolling the area at night. The primary spirit associated with the first-class pool is that of a little girl, often referred to as Jackie. The history books do show that drowning incidents occurred on the ship, though the specific identity of the child is debated. However, the consistency of the sightings is undeniable. Guests on the ghost tours often report seeing a small child in vintage clothing standing on the balcony overlooking the pool. She is sometimes heard giggling or calling out for her mother. But the most disturbing evidence found in the pool area involves physical residue. On multiple occasions, maintenance crews have opened the locked doors to the pool deck in the morning to find wet footprints on the dry tiles. These footprints are small, child-sized, and they lead from the edge of the empty pool toward the changing rooms, fading into nothingness. The water in the footprints has been tested. It is not fresh water from a leak. It is salt water. The pool has been drained for decades. Skeptics, of course, have attempted to debunk the phenomena on the Queen Mary. They point to the power of suggestion. The ship is old, it creaks, the metal expands and contracts with the temperature changes of Long Beach. They argue that the low-frequency vibrations, or infrasound, caused by the ventilation systems can cause hallucinations and feelings of dread. This is a scientifically valid theory. Infrasound can vibrate the fluid in the human eye, causing dark shapes to appear in peripheral vision. However, the infrasound theory fails to explain the collective experiences. It cannot explain how 5 people in a tour group who do not know each other all claim to see the same woman in a white evening gown dancing in the Queen's salon at the exact same moment. Whilst it cannot explain the physical evidence of the wet footprints or the recordings of intelligent responses to questions, one of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from the ship's own security detail. These are men and women who are not paid to tell ghost stories. They are paid to secure the vessel. There are documented logs of security officers refusing to patrol the lower decks alone. There is a famous incident where a security guard, watching the CCTV monitors, saw a figure walking by the pool. He radioed his partner to check it out. The partner arrived and saw nothing. But the guard in the control room was screaming over the radio that the figure was standing right next to him. The camera saw what the human eye could not. We must also consider the second-class pool area, often overshadowed by the first-class pool but equally active. It was here that many believe the spirit of a drowned soldier from the war days resides. Mediums have described this area as having a vortex of negative energy. Unlike the playful giggles of Jackie in the first-class pool, the second-class pool feels aggressive. People report sudden, intense headaches, nausea, and the overwhelming urge to flee the room. This aligns with the traumatic history of the ship during its time as the Gray Ghost, where thousands of men were crammed into spaces designed for hundreds, living in fear of the torpedo that could end their lives at any moment. The Queen Mary is a unique case study because it is a closed environment. It is a time capsule. The wood paneling, the Art Deco fixtures, and the smell of oil and brine. It all serves to anchor the past to the present. Paranormal researchers believe that the sheer amount of emotional energy expended on the ship, the joy of bon voyage parties, the terror of the war, the grief of the accidents, has stained the very fabric of the vessel. This is known as the stone tape theory. The idea that materials like steel and quartz can record events and replay them when the conditions are right. But some of the phenomena on the Queen Mary suggest something more than just a recording. A recording does not pull the sheets off your bed. A recording does not answer questions. A recording does not appear as a solid figure and then dissolve. This suggests an intelligent haunting, a consciousness that is trapped or chooses to remain within the steel walls. Let us return to the human element. Think of the psychological impact on the staff who have worked there for 20 or 30 years. There are interviews with former employees who speak of the lady in white near the Queen's salon. They speak of her with a casual familiarity, as if she is just another guest. They describe the piano in the salon playing a few notes on its own in the dead of night. They talk about the smell of cigar smoke in the non-smoking areas, a rich, expensive tobacco scent that matches the brand favored by Winston Churchill, who crossed on the Queen Mary multiple times during the war to meet with Allied leaders. Churchill's suite on the ship is another hot spot. It was his floating headquarters. The burden of the free world rested on his shoulders within those walls. Visitors to the suite often report the smell of that cigar smoke and a feeling of intense pacing, of anxiety, mirroring the Prime Minister's state of mind during the darkest days of the Blitz. The Queen Mary is a paradox. It is a place of glamour and a place of death. It is a tourist attraction and a tomb. The documented deaths on board, crew crushed by doors, cooks who died of heat stroke or worse, passengers who succumbed to heart attacks or suicide, create a census of the dead that rivals a small village. One of the most terrifying aspects of the Queen Mary haunting is the mimic phenomenon. There are reports from the lower decks of crew members hearing their own names called out by voices that sound exactly like their co-workers. A janitor might hear his supervisor calling him from around a corner, only to find the corridor empty, and then later learn that the supervisor was on the other side of the ship. This predatory aspect of the haunting, the ability to lure the living into isolated areas, adds a layer of malice to the legend. As we analyze the sheer volume of evidence, we have to ask ourselves, why here? Why this ship? Perhaps it is the water. Water is often cited in folklore and parapsychology as a conductor for spiritual energy. The Queen Mary spent her life surrounded by the deep, dark ocean, and now she sits in a permanent cradle of water. Or perhaps it is the iron. In folklore, iron repels spirits, but in this quantity, maybe it traps them. Maybe the steel hull acts as a Faraday cage for the soul, preventing the energy of the deceased from moving on, bouncing them back and forth within the corridors forever. The ship is a labyrinth. There are miles of corridors, some servicing the guests, others hidden behind panels for the crew. In these narrow, dimly lit passageways, the air is always cold. Even in the height of the California summer, there are cold spots on the Queen Mary that drop 20 degrees in the span of a single step. These are not drafts. These are pockets of entropy, where the energy is being sucked out of the air to fuel a manifestation. In recent years, the ship has fallen into disrepair, facing critical structural issues. As the rust spreads and the metal weakens, the activity seems to be spiking. It is as if the spirits are agitated by the decay of their vessel. The voices on the EVP recordings are becoming louder, more frantic. The shadows are becoming bolder. We must also touch upon the Vortex, reported in the dressing rooms of the first-class pool. This is described as a swirling mass of blacker-than-black darkness that distorts the light around it. Witnesses who have looked into this vortex describe a feeling of absolute void, a terrifying emptiness that feels like it is pulling at their very consciousness. Some researchers speculate this is a portal, a doorway that allows entities to come and go, which would explain why the census of ghosts on the ship seems to grow rather than diminish over time. The Queen Mary stands today not just as a hotel, but as a monument to the unexplained. It challenges our understanding of life and death. When you walk her decks, you are walking through history, but you are also walking through a crowd of invisible watchers. The woman in the 1930s gown, the young man in the blue coveralls, the little girl with the wet footprints. They are all still there. They are the permanent passengers. So, the next time you look at a photograph of this majestic liner, or consider booking a room for a night of history, remember the warning that many investigators give. You may check out of the Queen Mary, but something might just follow you home. The walls have ears, the decks have memories, and in the silence of the night, the gray ghost still remembers the screams of the Curacoa. This has been a deep dive into the Nocturnal Ledger. The line between history and horror is often just a matter of perspective, or perhaps a matter of whether the lights are on or off. We leave you with this question. If energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred, then where does the energy of 1,000 traumatic moments go? On the Queen Mary, the answer is simple. It stays. Sleep well if you can.